team's the first motion, I think,
About
about
unconditional love.
unconditional love. Yeah.
Can everyone hear me? Great. Okay. I'm going to do three things in the speech. First, a little bit of setup, then on why this is better for society, and lastly, on why it's better for individuals. A little bit of setup then. Firstly, we'd like to point out that this debate is not going to change things historically. I think, like, obviously a lot of religious doctrine is just derived from, like, a long time ago, and that's not really going to change because that was the conception of the world at the time. And also it's just to say that I think people in now is like are not as attached to doctrine as they are to the morality of doctrine as it is to just like other things in the religion. Secondly, what do we think this actually looks like? I think it's where a lot of Abrahamic religions who currently depict their gods as being perfect say that actually, you know, maybe, you know, they've made some mistakes in the past, the way that we've expressed things isn't right, we're willing to change that in the modern day. I think this is kind of analogous to like perhaps Hinduism, where they have a lot of variety of gods, where their gods aren't necessarily super moral, but they have like, you know, different traits that they perceive to be like the best version of that. Okay, then firstly, why do we get better outcomes for society? I think it's just to note how this massively reduces the power of religious doctrine to shape morality. Why do we think this is the case? Well, firstly, it's pretty intuitive, right? When people see that their God isn't like the beacon of morality, they're going to be less likely to want to follow that God in terms of morality, because why would you follow someone who is inherently immoral to make your moral decisions off of? That meant that these gods were less likely to shape morality, and also meant that individuals were more likely to determine morality on their terms. The second thing to say then is like, when you see a god who is depicted as immoral doing bad things, you don't interpret this to be like, this is a fault on your own thing, but you reinterpret it to mean like, oh, you know, like clearly this was just a fault on their side. That was clearly a good thing because that meant that you didn't shape your entire basis of morality on things that were actually just flawed. The third thing then is that now people are more likely to trust their own moral views, right? And the reason for this is when a god who is depicted as immoral now like is kind of closer to humanity in that sense, I guess, it means that you're more likely to trust your own views because you see yourself reflected in this God, because you see that, yes, it's okay to make mistakes, but actually I trust my own morality and my own judgment because I believe in a God who also makes those similar mistakes. Okay, the fourth thing then is to note that in the status quo, a lot of like the examples of religions with imperfect gods have multiple gods. And what that actually means then is that these religions are able to do this because they depict the right version of reality in many different ways. So you basically just get the conception, like many different conceptions of what like a good world looks like through the many different lenses of the different gods. And that is a really good thing because it means that people have a greater flexibility to choose what they specifically believe in that religion and to be able to determine themselves what they think the morality of like the world is, I guess. The last thing to then say, I guess, is that the like perfect conception of gods was derived from a really long time ago. That just means that it isn't going to be very relevant in today's world. Like obviously a lot has changed, and that's just really good because it means that people aren't so attached to this doctrine that they're willing to follow the morality of it. That was clearly always going to be a bad thing when it was really outdated. What we think the impact of this then is that firstly, it just changes the way that people view morality, right? And religion and how like religion and morality intersect. Because now religion isn't about specifically the morality of that God and what the choices of that God in that instant, like, you know, tens of thousands of years ago was, but necessarily how the universe is shaped. And also there's like no incentive for people to have to please their gods. And that's a really good thing because that means that you just get a lot more agency, right? But it also means that there's probably going to be like less opt-in for religion. Firstly, because we see that like as science and technology increases, people's like thoughts on thinking that like God exists are probably going to decrease because they're like, well, clearly this doctrine like wasn't right. But secondly, I think it's because people just don't believe that there's going to be a punishment if they act in a way that the doctrine says they shouldn't. And that's like, you know, how perhaps in religious doctrine 1,000 years ago it would have said that like this punishment means specifically that you're going to go to hell. Now that you know that religious doctrine is going to be imperfect, you're less likely to believe that there's going to be severe consequences. It means that you're less scared to like go out and do things on your own. That was always a really good thing, to have your own sense of morality. What the impact of that then is threefold. I think firstly, you just get more progressive views, and progressive views become more acceptable in the church. So what happens in the status quo is that there's just a massive fear for new ideas because they think that that's in contention with what their God wants. For example, you know, the way that the Bible refers to women, or the way that other religious doctrine refers to the queer community. Now that we know that God can make mistakes, that means that this fear doesn't exist. That means progressive views spread much more quickly. You just get, which leads me to my second impact, which is just you get a lot of people affected very, very positively, because firstly, they don't think they're going to get punished from their religion when they don't fit into a certain identity that's been like promoted as religious doctrine. But secondly, you're not likely to get like a lot of backlash from other people in the same religion as you, because you can explain to them that yes, this doctrine is outdated and it's bad. Thirdly, then, I think, actually, no, I'm going to move on. Okay, secondly, why do we think that this is better for individuals? A couple reasons. Firstly, I think it's just to say that religion is going to be a much smaller commitment on our world. Why? Because you don't have to spend your life following religious doctrine to a T. What this means is, because you know, like, and you know that you have your own sense of morality and your own sense of judgment, you don't have to necessarily conform to everything that's in there. You can have, you know, you can just use religious doctrine to see how it's shaped and views the world, instead of like being a literal list of commandments of how you should act in your everyday life. Secondly, then, people just feel less likely, feel less likely that they're going to be specifically punished that when bad things happen to them. So in the status quo, when bad things happen to people, they think it's because they have acted immorally, or not in the sense of how their religion wants. And that's to say that, like, you know, a lot of like religions just teach that like bad things happen to sinners, or like bad things happen to people who don't follow our religion. That is really, really harmful, because it means that if in the ordinary course of your life, like bad things happen to you, you now fear that there's something wrong about yourself. For example, if you're part of the queer community, you think there's something specifically wrong with you. That was clearly very harmful. That didn't exist on a world where we could say that this judgment was just flawed, right? Thirdly, I think it's just good that individuals can now question God. When God is perfect, you try to find meaning in bad things that happen to you, right? For example, let's say, you know, you're going for a job interview and you get rejected. In the status quo, you'll just be like, oh, well, that's like God's fault. God made that happen. When this doesn't happen, however, you instead, like, firstly, you just get more agency to believe that perhaps that's not the case. But secondly, you're just able to just question that rhetoric in yourself, and and that's good, because it does, firstly, it doesn't feel like you're betraying your religion to be able to go after what you want. But secondly, it just means that you just get a lot more agency, which feeds back into my first point. The last thing to say then is that people are just more self-forgiving, because if the creator of the literal universe makes mistakes, then you feel it's okay to make mistakes yourself. And that's obviously a good thing, because everyone makes mistakes. If everyone was like so scared that they were making mistakes, unlike their creator, that meant that there was a massive personal burden. We never wanted to say that. Okay, the neg may say that like, oh, God's a comforting to people, but like obviously the overall plan is going to be really hard to see from an individual standpoint. And sometimes there are just bad things that happen to you that you can't justify. And that's going to be really harmful if you think that your God doesn't make mistakes, because all that's going to happen is that you like question your own ability. That was obviously a really bad thing. We clearly got the better side.
Thank you so much for that speech. Now calling one.
Just checking that I'm audible.
Yep,
Awesome.
good to go.
We do not have crazy reverb in here. That's great. Three things in this speech. Firstly, on setup. Secondly, why this is better for the average religious person. And thirdly, why this allows religious, on their side, you allow religious leaders to escape accountability and worsen their actions. So firstly, just a piece of extraneous like rebuttal around the topic itself. Noting that this is like not a policy debate, it's a prefers debate. First, Af wants to tell you that we don't change like doctrine in the past. Yes, we do. We prefer religions which have like perfect gods, right? Like we would prefer for religions, we would prefer for religions to have perfect gods. I will also include this in setup that it's not about preferring some religions over the over others. So the material they bring you about like religions with imperfect gods, like having multiple gods, is like not relevant because we would have prefer all religions to have imperfect gods, whether singular or multiple. All right, so setup. What do we support? Firstly, a perfect God. What does this look like? We think it looks like purity of intentions and being perfect in their actions. It looks like, universal religious principles such as like forgiveness, kindness, etc., that they're unwavering in these. We think that's quite a good thing. Secondly, the perfect does not equate to all powerful. Like I think that if the CAs wanted us to talk about all powerful gods, they would have said omnipotent. But also perfection, like just empirically as a general knowledge, a general person understanding, perfection doesn't always relate to power. I think that this is a reasonable definition that someone can be perfect within their own capacity, but that doesn't necessarily define or change the role that they have and the power that they have and who they are. Okay. Thirdly, we're talking about the same religions, not some over others. So particularly when First Av says that like, there are multiple gods, you get like a variety of viewpoints. I think that like this is wouldn't reasonably happen. Like reasonably, this Christianity, if it were to have a perfect God, is unlikely to like introduce a few more for the fun of it. Like, I think that the most reasonable interpretation is that there's just a switch between imperfect and perfect, that other changes aren't necessarily likely to happen, that this is like the most reasonable thing, that they have always had a perfect God, and it's probably broadly similar otherwise. Okay, cool. What do they support? Again, knowing that this isn't a policy debate, they need to support imperfection. This is fine, like generally from their side. Okay, so like this likely looks like, actions that aren't perfect. It potentially looks like gods that are like vengeful, such as in like the Old Testament, vengeful, wanting revenge, like that people are quite scared of, noting that God doesn't, and then God doesn't live up to their ideals sometimes. So that's probably what it looks like under their side. All right. So why is this better for the average religious person? We think that at the start of this, I want to note that the purpose of religion is to like give people comfort and motivation to like persevere in what is quite an imperfect and sometimes tough to live in world. So why is having a perfect role model a good thing to aspire to? Firstly, is something to work towards. So I think it's important to say here that this isn't the expectations you have for yourself. Like no one personally inspires to be exactly like God. That's just not what people do in the real world, right? Like it's something to look up to. It's something that's a different being than yourself. But they can aspire to perfection, right? Like if another being that's more powerful and just better in all other ways than yourself is not even perfect, then like you can expect yourself to be even more imperfect than this thing, like this entity. So we think that if they're aspiring towards perfection and to be as close to that as possible, then that's a good thing. Comparing yourself to a deity isn't encouraged in most religions. They're not going to be like mad at themselves that they've like messed up sometimes, that they aren't perfect, all right? I think that this just looks like being like more perfect in terms of being kind to neighbors and engaging in religious charity. I think that's quite a good thing in terms of people's actions, right? On affirmative, God is not perfect. So people kind of accept themselves as imperfect and like don't work on things. So this basically what it does is it shifts the narrative on sins from like, oh, that's okay, like, but just do better next time. Like, that's okay, you're human, but do better next time. Aspire to be better, aspire towards a perfect God. It shifts the narrative from that to just like, oh, it's okay, even God's not perfect. That's okay. Like, there's kind of not this like aspect of self-improvement and continuous aspiration that we think is a really positive thing for people's actions. Okay, so why is this more comforting? Like, the world just can be tough. It is imperfect. There's lots of suffering in the world. And noting that this is quite directly responsive to what Ath has brought you, we think that like the way that a perfect God can address this is that even with like no action or necessarily like things going right for people, people could have the knowledge that there are like good things out there, that there's a good being that like, you know, is doing the most they can or is perfect in their intentions. It brings you comfort in your worst moments. Like the idea that also like people harming you will receive justice, not that God must just hate you, right? Because in a world where you have a vengeful, angry God who has been known to do like, you know, horrible acts to people or whatever, or just be really angry at people, you think that God must hate you and be vengeful towards you, whereas you're more likely in our world to just think that like, you know, oh, this is like is something that God wasn't quite powerful enough to do, right? But at the same time, like they're looking out for me. And when we all have our day at like, you know, in the afterlife, if that exists in the religion, then you know people receive their fair judgment. We think that that's good solace. And then the next section of this is why perfect afterlife arbitration is good, noting that the purity of morals means that arbitration will be perfect, right? Firstly, if you're dying horribly, you believe that you're going to go to heaven. That's quite a good thing. In people's lives where they have nothing else going for them, they can at least believe that they will have a good afterlife. And that's like promoted as like, you know, a really happy, good thing, right? Like that's quite a big comfort to a lot of people. And secondly, you believe that the people like killing you or whatever will definitely go to hell. That's really nice and like cathartic for you. So at every step in your life, this is beneficial for you because you improve your circumstances if you can. You have comfort if you can't. And even on your deathbed, you are comforted by the idea of this perfect God that someone will eventually like look out for you within their means. All right, so the second argument on how this allows religious leaders on their side to escape accountability and worsens their actions. So first up on this, noting that people tend to perceive religious leaders as like the closest to the divine possible, right? Like as we've already established, people don't directly compare themselves to the divine. In general, but like people perceive religious leaders as a lot closer. Like, you know, for example, the Pope is God's embodiment on earth. So why do we improve religious leaders? Firstly, it's harder to escape scrutiny, right? If you're held to a standard that's a bit closer to God than the average person, then if that God is imperfect, you can say, oh, but even God's not perfect, right? Like I'm fine for like committing some child sex abuse, right? In the past, right? Like you can kind of make these claims. Whereas when we have a God that is perfect, then people are held to this higher standard to a greater extent to be like God or to be their embodiment, right? They're not going to say that they're less like God because this depowers them. They're more likely to just act to a higher standard, right? Then, secondly, it is harder to persecute communities, right? There's an emphasis on forgiveness and tolerance of these universal religious principles on our side, rather than like, you know, a God that is sometimes vengeful. And persecution is generally seen as pretty vengeful. So, you know, in the world where God has never been vengeful, then this is like less able to be, you know, rationalized or excused. Finally, on why we get less extremists claiming to be God, right? So this is much more plausible if God is imperfect. Humans are probably not perfect. You can point to at least one thing that a kind of like wannabe cult leader has done wrong in their life. So it's much easier to dispute the fact that they are God, right? These people just tend to do very bad things if they are successfully able to claim to be God and people believe them, right? You get a much more cult-like following. They're willing to ignore like human rights abuses and stuff like that. Just empirically, it tends to look like pretty awful things like genocides, etc. I think that on our side, we get people comfort and we also get people better material circumstances. We think that morals are not outdated, as Af would have you believe, that they are things that are very relevant in today's circumstances. So proud to propose.
Thank you so much for your speech. Now calling second affirmative.
Okay, hello. Sorry, give me 1 sec. Cool. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Firstly, a clarifying point of setup. Secondly, on societal benefits and how that pushes back on us are woefully inadequate at talking about the different ways that we perceive religion. Thirdly, on why it's better for religious people and responding to that stuff on religious leaders. And lastly, a push on flexibility of doctrine. Firstly, in setup, the thing that I want to note here is I think they conceive of this debate incorrectly. They explain that it's a prefers debate. It is not a prefers a world debate. It is not a debate in which we prefer that religion's gods were perfect. It is not a debate in which we preferred that we prefer that religions depicted their gods as religious. It's a present tense like verb that is used in the sentence, kind of a weird justification for it, but clearly this operates as we would prefer if religions as they existed now, or in some context, were just religious. It's not something that historically extends to change large aspects of the world previously. Also, their arguments don't relate to a lot of those, that specific distinction, kind of confusing. Last thing I want to say here is that clearly they've conceived of this debate as conceiving that it is about gods being perfect in themselves. They talk about things like a moral standard. I just want to note here that it is clearly about the depiction of gods as perfect, as in we prefer religions that do not depict their gods to the masses, to the outside world, to anyone as perfect individuals, regardless of how those gods actually act in reality. So pointing to things like divine vengeance are not the same thing, because saying that that's morally unjustified is not the exact same thing, because that is applying a current moral standard and saying that that is bad behavior. That is not how we view it, because it's viewed as perfect. Okay, how does this have societal benefits? Let's deal with this. Their first push here, which I think is incredibly limited, is just to say that this is, instead, this is like, so actually, I don't think they respond to our societal benefits nearly at all. Their main response is just to say that it's not necessarily multiple gods and that these constrictions are not as wide as we say they otherwise are. But obviously, we explain to you quite clearly that people view moral dictates as a less binding form of doctrinal source, which means that there is no direct model of behavior which they have to abide to, or otherwise they will be punished because they do not model themselves on the perfection of God. The second thing that I want to note here is they're incredibly uncomparative when they talk about people not comparing themselves to God to try and respond to us in the same way, because all of their later points rely on you comparing yourself to God. Stuff about working to a moral standard is obviously people comparing themselves at each stage and striving towards what God does. Obviously, people do compare themselves to him. So at the point where it's an imperfect standard, obviously this does just mean that you probably have less societal buy-in to religion, but also more importantly, this just means that you trust your individual moral agency more. And what that explains is just that at each step, rather than checking your moral intuitions against exactly what the doctrine tells you to do, you're more likely to trust your moral intuitions going forward because you think that there could be some imperfection in the doctrine, imperfection in God's word or God's judgment, which just means that you're more likely to believe that your own instincts about how you should act towards others in the world around you are correct, or at the very least that you are closer to the standard of someone like a God that is imperfect and makes decisions on the relational world around them, that you can also judge things based on your material circumstances, not necessarily on a divine judgment in itself. Last thing I just want to say is that very, very clearly we claim the best cases in this debate, which is just to say that in current instances where people view God as an imperfect being, for example, more progressive priests within the church, those individuals are the cases that we talk about because they view doctrine as imperfect, because they view people as changeable and people as capable of making mistakes without being condemned to eternal damnation. Those are the best cases and the most comforting cases for people that actually experience serious oppression under the yoke of religious guilt and under the yoke of things like historical religious views on gender or on sexuality. Okay, firstly on better for religious people, because this is where the majority of their push in this debate comes. First thing that they say is that it's a far more comforting world where you believe that God is perfect. Firstly, note that this is just untrue because, firstly, it's not God perfect as in God looking out for you. It's God's perfect as in God's plan for the world is perfect. So whatever individual actions that occur, those are predestined to have occurred to you, which just means that you don't view it as something that is necessarily in your best interests, but something that was going to happen anyway, which just means that you view or are more bitter towards God under their world. So you view it as something that is unjustly ordained towards you. You view it as a divine punishment because you think that that doctrine cannot be doubted, because you think that that everything that happens in the world must be from the actions of a divine God. They say gods are never, they say that this isn't necessarily an omnipotent God or an all-powerful God, but obviously this is just true in the vast majority of cases when you're talking about when you're talking about God in Islam or in Christianity, for example, which are two the most prominent and most believed versions of perfect gods. Obviously, in those cases, it just is true that they're omnipotent, that they do determine all of the ways of the world. Note that there is doctrines like predestination in those faiths. Secondly, note that people's lives just are fucked, which is to say that bad things happen to people all the time, and it's incredibly hard to find comfort in that fact if you believe that it has been determined upon you. Because they say that it's things like viewing God as vengeful, but obviously it is unlikely that you view God as more vengeful under their side than our side, because under our side you view any individual material punishment that occurs to you as an instrument of God's will, and that is far, far worse for your perception of God. But lastly, we just explained that we offer a far more comforting world, because it's a world in which bad things can happen, but you as an individual are not determined to go along a certain path. It is one in which you have individual agency, in which you as a religious person can still potentially step outside the limits of doctrine, even where that benefits your life, even where it is not divinely ordained to you, which just is a far, far better which is a far better benefit than anything they can give you on comfort, because obviously agency far scales beyond that. We allow people to make any decision. We don't just make material circumstances in their lives a little bit more bearable. Second thing they say is that it's good to look up to. I think this is kind of a weak point in a number of ways. Firstly, they say moral perfection is what's needed to aspire. Firstly, we would note that there's obviously other moral standards which allow people to aspire to, which is, for example, because they are humans, because they are social creatures, and because they form personal bonds regardless of religion, they care about their friends, they care about their family. So obviously treating people around them correctly or having an overall moral view of doing the right thing by not causing pain in the world is a conclusion that people can come to on their own without the need for morality. And I would note explicitly that where people did come to that conclusion historically in the past, it was massively railed against by Christianity, which saw that as a violation of their doctrine to have human agency and morals. But also, secondly, it's obviously very bad to compare yourself to a perfect standard that you can never achieve. That just means you're constantly doubting yourself. You constantly view yourself as imperfect in God's eyes and unable to achieve the standard that should be set to you. You are never able to live up to that perfect standard, and that ruins your life as a religious person, especially in the case where you're a queer person or you're someone that does not conform to traditional religious doctrine. Last thing I would note is that they say people view God as vengeful now, but obviously the Christian God as it currently exists is a justified vengeance. That's what they view it as, because when God is angry, when God is vengeful, the perfection that is imbued is the perfection of judgment and the perfection of punishment, which is to say that this is the right thing to do, even when it is something like anger, because there is no inherent religious precept or morality towards actions like anger. Okay, on improving religious leaders, two responses. First of all, they say, instead of saying I'm imperfect, so I can do these potentially bad things, that all actions that they take are imbued by their divine mandate, because they always justify their position of power and doctrine in the church by being placed there by the king. The Pope, for example, is God's chosen individual to lead the church, which just means that they're able to justify all of their actions as flowing from God's will in most cases. But also, secondly, more importantly, they're just unlikely to publicize these actions in themselves, which is to say that if they critique the actions of others for being imperfect, then they are seen to perpetuate imperfect actions themselves, then they can get called out on being imperfect. It spreads doubt in the church and in the doctrine, and leaders don't want that, because obviously they prefer the doctrinal power over millions of people. They prefer the power of the position of the church than their individual agency to do particularly bad moral acts. So they would always suppress this information instead of sharing it and taking accountability. Obviously, there's no change there. Lastly, on flexibility of doctrine, in my last few seconds. Firstly, factually, imperfection is human and it's supportive of change. It's a conception of mistaken conceptions, not just individual actions. Secondly, because it allows you to contravene doctrine without being punished in the extremity, which just means that you can make a mistake or you can cross the boundaries of doctrine, and then you're not likely to get instantly cast out of consideration by the church. And you can explain why that transgressed boundary is something that necessarily shouldn't exist within the church. It allows you to make moral change. Lastly, it means they don't reject difference outright, which means people that live different lifestyles are given greater advice, greater voice. It means that you are just getting more healthy versions of, I don't agree with their lifestyle, but they can't impose it with divine mandates, and they can't say it, can't reject their ability to do it. You just get more accepting societies, even when there's moral precepts against certain lifestyles still so proud to affirm. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that speech. Now calling second negative.
Am I audible? Nice. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, opposition has vastly overcomplicated this debate. They've overcomplicated the set of morals that religions actually preach, and they've overcomplicated what is good and what is bad and what the goal of religion is. So, two key points so far. Who achieves better quality of life for religious people? Opposition has staked almost all of their case here. It is an important issue, but not the only important issue. And who decreases harms from religious leaders and harms from religion? Opposition has given a very hand-wavy mitigatory response here, like one mechanism responding to our whole case. I'm going to get back to that later and show how this is inadequate. So, onto this first point. Who achieves better quality of life for religious people? This obviously weighs quite highly because there's a lot of religious people, and even small changes lead to big impact across the world and in people's lives. So, first point, are gods comforting in times when you are experiencing like adverse circumstances, whether because of your own actions or because of actions like you can't explain or you don't know the causes of? So, we brought you the general claim that if people believe that God is perfect, if God is morally pure, then people think that like he is acting in your best interest. He is acting to create a world that is as good as he can, and therefore that God's plan is a good thing that people aspire to. Opposition had a few responses here. Firstly, they claimed that people would start to doubt God's plan because it is negatively affecting them or because it feels imperfect in the moment. We say this is like fundamentally contradictory to the nature of religion. If you accept, and for this debate to work, you have to accept this, if you accept that people are like strongly religious and believe in God, which obviously a large group of people are, then they believe that that God, if he is perfect, is moving to make your life better. So they are not going to doubt the plan, regardless of their current circumstances. Obstacles they're experiencing look more like setbacks in a plan that leads to positive change rather than like God's failure or punishment or whatever. And so opposition's sort of mini response to this was that people would think that like God was moving towards a universal good plan as opposed to a good plan individually, and that you might be a sacrifice in this plan. This just clearly isn't true. If you consider like literally any religious doctrine, it is between you and God. It is incredibly individual. Every major religious doctrine teaches that God is like looking out for you personally. So this simply isn't true. People think that God has a plan for you and he's moving towards a positive outcome. So what is the counterfactual? What happens in their world? One of two things. Either people look at the negative circumstances in their life and they think that because God is imperfect, that he is failing to make positive change, and therefore they're experiencing God's failure. This is incredibly devastating because it questions like the key tenet of your religion, of your belief. Or you believe that God is like trying to punish you. God is vengeful. Now, opposition tried to claim that, like, under their world, people wouldn't conceive of God as a vengeful deity. This just obviously is not correct, because if God is perfect, then he holds a set of moral values that are infallible and include very simple things like forgiveness, acceptance, and kindness. These are obviously things that a perfect deity would hold. So therefore, their God is far more vengeful, far more likely to hold grudges, to punish you for small things. So people in their world believes that like setbacks in their life are punishments from God, which is obviously incredibly harmful. It compounds the actual impact of these circumstances in your life, makes it far worse. On our side, they think it's part of a plan that will eventually end in good, and therefore are far more willing to live through them. But even if you don't buy this, even if you think people are going to question God's plan, you still have something to strive for. Because the only reason people question God's plan is if they think they've done something personally wrong. But if they have a perfect standard to aspire to, and I'll note quickly that like literally every religious doctrine forbids becoming God. We've told you this at first, that people are less likely to model themselves, like try to become God. No one is striving towards an impossible perfect standard. They're looking for something they're looking to move towards this as much as they can. If people think that their actions have caused bad things to happen in their life, then they at least have something positive to strive towards, and therefore an ability to feel as if they are actioning positive change in their own life. In opposition's world, since God is imperfect, and since no one can match God, people will aim for a far lower tier of moral purity, then they don't improve themselves as much and they don't get the benefits here. But even in the worst case, if you doubt that that your life is going to be good, you know that the afterlife is certain in our world and is perfect, whereas under their world, it simply isn't that case. And they did not respond adequately to the afterlife material we brought you at first, which is incredibly important for people who are like in extremely bad circumstances. An imperfect God necessarily means an imperfect heaven, a heaven where like the good and the bad are not sufficiently judged, where you might be denied access to heaven because you committed some minor sins, because God is vengeful, as I brought you earlier. Whereas a perfect God means that this judgment is made perfectly. He is forgiving, he is kind. Therefore, people in the worst circumstances have at least something to look for. They don't have this in their world. Now, their key response to all of this was that religion would somehow become less important in people's lives. They would follow doctrine for a lesser extent, and for a few reasons. The first key reason is that under their side, they claim there will be less fear of punishment for deviating from God's doctrine. Now, the first point here is I asked opposition team to tell me exactly why, like, religious doctrine in the broader sense is a bad thing. Like the Christian Bible and the Jewish Bible lists a set of very simple commandments, like do not kill, do not steal, love your neighbor. Very simple things I'm sure both sides can agree are like universally positive. Pretty much everything that has stemmed from this historically that is negative is an interpretation of this, and I'm going to get to why that is better on our side later. But the core tenets are fundamentally good things. But even if you don't buy that they're good, I'd argue that on both sides, the like punishments for breaking these things are relatively symmetrical, if not worse, on opposition side. So under our world, these punishments are fairly soft for minor transgressions, things like making small violation in your religious principles or whatever, because our God is perfect. There is salvation. There is the idea that you can like redeem yourself because he is working to make you as perfect as possible. Whereas under their world, a vengeful God is much more likely to prosecute you for like very minor transgressions, which means that people are far more scared of making mistakes against doctrine, which pretty much wipes out all of the material about agency and so forth. People cling much more to doctrine on their side, even if that's a bad thing. Now, is doctrine a bad thing? So the key thing we have to prove here is that doctrine becomes more progressive over time under our side. It becomes more positive and it moves forward. Opposition's response to this was that people will be scared of change if they have a perfect standard that they feel they need to appear to, and therefore things like homophobia would become enshrined because they're seen as perfect. So firstly, people being homophobic is not linked to like a perfect or imperfect God. It's just people who are like not very good in general. This is pretty symmetric, and they use religion to justify it. But an imperfect God necessarily means that you accept homophobia to a far greater extent, because it means that like very clear doctrinal principles like do no harm, like love your neighbor, become more flexible. This person like is doing something that might be against our current doctrine. We should like punish them heavily instead of forgiving them. And so under our world, we have a far more progressive religious system because people feel as if they like have very clear standards to move towards, and they can evaluate they can evaluate current societal values against like very simple religious principles, see if they meet. So we get more progressive religion. Now, opposition barely responded to our religious harms point. Their only real response is that like religious leaders would suppress the harms they do. Like obviously in both worlds, they're likely to get found out by like the legal systems for committing harms against their followers. But under our world, other religious leaders are much more likely to call out their peers for harms because they have a perfect standard to look for. Imperfections are not forgiven in religious leaders to the same extent, since they're seen as like quite close to God, although not God. So therefore, harms are far worse under their side. So proud to negate.
Well, thanks so much for that speech. Now calling third affirmative.
Yeah, I also think it would be super chill if the Christian God was fun and kind and loving all the time and had never said anything potentially homophobic or justified stoning as a punishment. Unfortunately, the debate is not that religion should make their gods perfect by the negative team's definition. It's that these religions should depict the gods they have right now, and the gods that were created often in the vast majority of instances 500, 1,000 years ago, when societal values were obviously much more different as now, depict those gods as perfect and having a perfect intent. So just because these gods are depicted as perfect does not mean the morality that they represent is perfect by my interpretation of what good morality is. And that is the reason why we're going to win this debate. Two things in this speech, firstly on society and secondly on religious individuals. Firstly on society, and pushing back against their stuff about accountability right now. I think the fact that they tell you that these people who are at the top of religion are viewed as close to divine as possible gives them credibility when they fuck people over in a way that they absolutely don't get when God is far more imperfect, because these people become closer to perfect, or definitely closer to perfect than you as the person who is criticizing them is, right? So they have a greater capacity to understand and justify their actions in many instances. Obviously, they have the justification that God would never make the mistake of choosing the wrong person. The Catholic Church in general could suggest that if the Pope did something majorly bad, that God would not have chosen the Pope if he was not going to act in a particularly well way. The second thing I would just kind of note on this accountability, sometimes the really fucked thing is that the bad thing that religious people can do is justified by the text. So when the text of when the Book of Mormon says that Mormons should give 10% of their income to the church in Utah, that continues and cannot be rewritten or re-understood, even though it allows coercive financial control over the people who believe in that religion as well. And no one can question it because God told you to. The third thing that we explain, though, and incredibly important, that I don't really think gets adequately responded to, is that you just get suppression within the religion, right? They tell you might be able to access it by the legal system, but obviously it's really difficult for people to come forward to the legal system at the point at which they believe that this is the bad thing that might have occurred to them was part of God's plan, and that God might be particularly angry with them if they questions God's perfection by trying to take someone that God ordained to be higher than them to the legal system, which means that you're unlikely to have the legal system see it in the first place. And of course, the people with the most power in religion are the most religious, so they buy into the fact that people who've done these wrong things, I guess, were correct in doing them as well in the first place. So that suppression is likely to occur, but also what Felix says, which is just that it's not in their interest to sow dissent or to undermine their own doctrinal authority by showing that they do the wrong thing, also is another reason to cover it up as well. But finally, if people are just less religious, then they don't vest such energy or authority in these people in the first place. And because I'm about to explain to you that the average person just cares about religion far less, that means that this point about accountability is less important. Okay, why are far fewer people religious, or why is doctrine substantially more flexible right now? The reason why people are religious right now, so the reason why people were religious in the past is because it was a way to explain the workings of the universe. And a kind of associated part of that was that also at the same time, you then got kind of a moral code that religion had given to you as well, and applying that allowed you to kind of control the universe in some sense. The reason why people are still religious today is because they are so ingrained with the notion that religion is associated with good versus evil, and you grow up on this idea, this basis of being religion is how you are a good person and a moral person, that even though people are a little bit more skeptical about some of the other stuff about religion, they still buy into it being ultimately an important thing in their life. Notably, this changes at the point at which you just don't vest the same amount of credibility into the moral judgment which religion makes, which obviously you wouldn't in a world where God was imperfect. Firstly, you're skeptical about getting any of your moral judgment from another imperfect entity in the first place. Why would you stone someone for taking an action that you disagreed with, or for taking an action that maybe God disagreed with, if you didn't believe that God was necessarily a perfect arbiter of moral authority, or could make mistakes, or could miss something that someone had done that meant they ought not be stoned? It's just hard to believe the kind of really serious things that the Bible tells you, that the Bible or religious text tells you, because you have skepticism about whether or not the person making that judgment is someone who is actually perfect. But secondly, you then get different interpretations within the religion to explain why God is imperfect, or to explain in what way God is imperfect. So that means that people could pick and choose between the conception of morality that fits mostly with what they like, which means that therefore people are kind of more developing their moral on their own. But also, of course, you're closer to God as an individual, so you're able to make these moral justifications on your own as well, and you trust your own judgment here. This is really important because it does mean that there's significantly more amount of doctrinal flexibility. Doctrinal flexibility because people care about what God says less, but I also just think that means there's less buy-in to religion in general. Obviously, on doctrinal flexibility, the reason why this is so important is because the impacts that it has on society are relatively massive. So originalist and reading versions of Islam that are closer to the text, famously things like Wahhabism, which is often practiced in Saudi Arabia, are much more extreme, conservative, punitive, result in groups of people having fewer rights, because the original text of Islam is one in which the God is punitive and acts poorly towards other people. Obviously, things like, yes, we totally agree that things like homophobia exist in the past anyway, but what we explained to you at Emily uniquely is that once people start becoming more progressive, the church cannot act as the same barrier to those things being enshrined in the legal system that it occurred over like the past 50 years. And this change happens far more quickly because people don't associate the original text with something that they have to follow because God is perfect. Instead, they realize that it may be a mistake, society has progressed, and that can be explained to them by leaders of their religion as well, people that they trust. So you get progress much more quickly. Why are we likely to be flexible with the bad things but not the good ones? Because as you can see, even our society today, moral standards haven't gone down because fewer people are religious, because obviously people still have an incentive to act well towards each other. The things that in the Bible, like do not steal, that are really good that they tell you, are just sort of common sense things to people. The reason why religion is important to people in morality is for the things that aren't necessarily so intuitive, and those are likely to be the ones that are relatively progressive, are the things that people hold on to. Secondly, on individuals and why their path to victory here doesn't make sense, because they did not explain to you why God stopped doing bad things under their side of the house. Like, they are stuck with the Old Testament, right? Like, the debate happens right now. We prefer a world in which Christianity is, we prefer for Christianity to be saying, actually, the Old Testament God, he was having a bit of a moment there, as opposed to saying he was doing things absolutely perfect there, which is what they have to defend here. So all their things about God looking out for you, God caring about you, they have to defend this vengeful God being perfect, which would say for the reasons that they identify is something that is going to be actively harmful to people or actively discomforting. But other things to respond to when they tell things like comfort, we would just say that sometimes the idea that God having a plan for you isn't particularly comforting, or is actually really difficult to square up, and can be particularly difficult for people to understand in relation to their religion, right? So if you experience something really traumatic, like your child dying, for example, when they're relatively young, people will tell you that it's part of God's plan, and you might view it as God's plan, but that's really difficult to understand why God did this to you, why he would make you suffer so much pain. Perhaps because you feel so much pain, you do view it as God's plan, you view it as a plan to fucking punish you for something, and that, of course, makes you feel bad, as if you had spurned God in some way that you couldn't do alternatively. But secondly, we also explain that it's extremely bad for individual people's agencies, right? Because people think that God is perfect, they look to the universe for signs, and they believe in God and God is speaking to them. They look to the universe for signs on how they should act, right? And so people take things like individual rejections for perhaps applying for a job or applying for something they really want as a sign that it's not part of God's plan. Even if they really want something, they don't try for it again, because they don't want to, again, anger God by suggesting that they are not perfect in this instance as well. But finally, God is just also not necessarily looking out for people, as you like to explain. Even in this kind of perfect God comforting world, God is a fucking arbiter in Christianity of good and evil. He decides whether you're not good enough to go to the afterlife after the fact. So obviously that's really terrible. And finally, we just point out that a lot of these religions suggest that God is perfect, but that humans consistently spurn him by doing things like sinning. So people still believe that they have the capacity to do bad things, and God has the capacity to punish them. Just because they think that God is perfect, that doesn't mean that that everything they do is done by God as well. I think a lot of harm that they tell you about those people being shaken, but obviously, again, if fewer people are religious in the first place, then that doesn't happen to the same degree. The end of this debate, obviously, individuals are not comforted by a God that is evil and terrifying, and that is the God in the world that we live in right now, proud to propose.
Thank you so much for your speech. Now calling to negative to conclude today's debate.
Cool. Hey guys, thanks for bearing with me, and thanks to Anne for holding this beautiful thing here. I assume I'm all audible and visible if I speak like that. I'm not too soft, am I? Perfect, thanks. Cool. When people go into a church, a mosque, or a temple, they do it to escape a deeply imperfect and a deeply scary world around them. A world that involves things like debating from park benches, a world that involves things like countless amounts of suffering that occur to people, and a world that often is just pretty depressing. I think only two things should be depicted as perfect. Firstly, my novices on this ballot, and secondly, God. Two parts of the speech. I'm first going to talk about individuals, then I'm going to talk about social structures and kind of religious institutions. I'm going to start with individuals. This is the most important part of this debate for a range of reasons, because religious individuals are billions of people around the world, and often they would identify religion as being the most important part of their lives. The impact on here is relatively sudden in terms of their ability to enjoy religion, their ability to find solace there, and a win on individuals, because there are so many religious individuals around the world, sadly helps us win society. I'm at the top of this issue on individuals. I'm going to, unfortunately, I have to deal with the issue of what this looks like. And I would just like to say that Australian National University too, thank fuck that this is not an in-round, because all of our speaks would be in the garbage, but I think you should punish them for that and not us. Let's go through the weeds then. Okay, the first thing I'm going to say is, we don't have to defend a god that is omnipotent. We set this up very clearly at Maya. And even if you do believe for the religions that gods are omnipotent, often they don't intervene in everything that happens in the world, right? It's like a god can be all powerful, but they can also be just like quite busy a lot of the time. So like you not getting a job interview, they probably don't give a fuck about. I don't think you interpret those kind of material things like badly. And look around you. Do religions blame the downtrodden and poor people as being like, oh, you are evil? Obviously, this does not occur. That's not a reasonable characterization of the way this works. Okay, the second thing I would say is they say we have to defend a god that is vengeful, and that vengeance being shown is perfect. But as I'll get onto later, this is a first debate, so we do just change the way that doctrine is shown. So you are more likely, because I also just think the vengeance is quite bad, and stoning is quite bad, and those things like directly kind of contradict the things and moral standards that are set up for them. So you are just less likely to focus on through preaching on the stuff about the toil, the fire and fury, and that being justified, because obviously that's in contention with the do not kill your neighbor, even if your neighbor is gay, that sort of stuff there. I think as well, just God being imperfect can look like a range of things. Like God literally abandons his son on the cross in his agony on the 9th hour of the cross when Christ cried out, Dio mio, por qué me hai abandonato? That is something that's particularly harmful. And we don't think that we should be showing this sort of ability of gods to just abandon their children and stuff. That's probably bad for parent-child relationships. Finally, on the number of gods, obviously this doesn't affect the number of gods. That would be a polytheist, many gods or one god debate. I don't think they can claim that, Max. Also, I'm not aware that that we preferred motion. So I don't think the grammatical push that we get from second affirmative gets them very far. I think this just locks out a lot of the material, and it is pretty fun. Let's get more substantially into this issue then. They say that individuals can question God, and that is particularly important. But I think if you're someone who wants to question God when they're imperfect, why would you be going to religion? You're looking for certainty, you're looking for protection. That is something that's particularly important. All these kind of science-pilled people are probably going to leave religion on either side of the house. These are not the religious people that are likely to be particularly important. People crave reassurance because that's what they do not have in an uncertain world. First affirmative seems to suggest that maybe you get less buy into religion, but I don't know that that's a good thing, because the real preferences of these people to believe incredibly strongly in these religious figures, you don't want to decrease necessarily those things there. On individuals constructively, we explain a range of things. We explain that this can be an aspirational ideal that you strive towards and you improve your life. You are kinder to your neighbor. You're more likely to donate. And of course this happens in quite a way that's quite fun for the negative team, because you strive for it, but you never expect to meet it, right? So you want to do that, do a little bit better, take a step closer to God, but you don't punish yourself for not being perfect, because obviously, as Sam quite excellently explains, you don't actually have an expectation of you becoming God there for the average layperson. Secondly, this is just incredibly comforting, as I explained in my introduction. And thirdly, I think it has a range of benefits that happen to people on their deathbeds. The second part of this debate I'm going to chat about is on, so I think perfect gods are really comforting people. They help them improve. That is incredibly important. And I would note as well, the types of religions that they talk about having perfect interpretations, things like the Abrahamic ones, literally the big three religions, indicates that individuals like these types of religions because they are the most successful. There are a lot more people who follow Judaism and Christianity and Islam around the world than there are people who follow Hinduism. So I think just on a revealed preference on what individuals prefer, we are almost intuitively ahead. Cool. Let's look at social institutions there. I would just say that they have a pretty high bar on this stuff because they're pretty ambitious in the types of impacts they want to claim. Queer people still face a lot of violence in like Hindu societies, like India and that sort of stuff. There, obviously, you still have lots of like discrimination against like Muslims in India. It's not this case that it's like, oh, you have an imperfect God and now you're super, super tolerant. I think there are a range of other reasons that religions are shit to queer people and to women. Their main claim is that now religion has a less of a hold on morality. And as Sam explains, often religious morality is quite good because it focuses on principles. And yes, like, of course, there are some sus things written in the Bible about gay people. But I think, like, when you approach those gay people with kindness, when you approach it with tolerance, when you approach it as, like, with that charity stuff that you're more likely to donate there, that is something that necessarily counterbalances. And I think religions, over time, on both sides of the house, but especially on our house, has an incentive to moderate. You don't want to, like, kill your own followers. That's pretty, like, bad. And, like, that certainly goes against the, like, will of God, of a perfect God, because that's literally a commandment. So I don't actually think we get stoning of like a gay people there. But I think we get less of that. Cool. The next thing they say is that people are likely to be punished because like for like queer phobia and stuff. And I think we're just able to defeat this when you have more of a focus of forgiveness and on tolerance. And I would like to respond for a second time to Ali's claim about like, oh, now you must portray a vengeful God as perfect. I think it's pretty intuitive for people that vengeance is an undesirable like trait from God's own like metric. It's like you should not kill people, that sort of stuff. So I think the way that like religions portray this is they just focus less on the vengeance and less on the evil stuff and killing people, and a lot more on the like happy, fun, yay, tolerant stuff, which obviously gets us a win on this issue here. Cool. They also say that you can get different interpretations and that that's maybe a good thing. But I think different interpretations lead to things like schisms, which promote a lot of religious violence, and that can be something that's pretty bad. I don't think that's necessarily a benefit for them on their debate. But compare that to so those mechanisms like maybe influence a little bit the way that society functions, all that type of stuff there. But our arguments and mechanisms are very specific to the specific sets of religious institutions. We explain that you increase accountability, you're more likely to get reporting because you just hold these religious leaders to a higher standard. And I think that is something that's like particularly good. And of course, they don't see them as God on earth, but you say that no, you should be perfect, and you can't like kind of sweep things under the rug, escape criticism by just being like even God was imperfect there. And I think also we don't get a response like the cult leaders analysis, which I think is quite good, and also like the treatment of groups is less likely to be tolerant on our side of the house. So incredibly proud to oppose. I'm gonna love you, Alipa.
Thank you so much for all the speeches today. I kindly request everyone to exit the breakout room so that we can have a deliberation.